All right, so our topic today is what are some of the major factors contributing to environmental change? Um, and the slides were designed to accompany the book People, Places, and Culture. And I am, of course, Miss Gall, your lecturer for the day. So the first thing we want to talk about is an approach to geography called political ecology. And essentially, political ecology is a way of asking nested questions to ultimately get down to how things that happen at one scale can be affected by things that happen at other scales in other places. And so another way of looking at this as well, as your book says, Leslie Gray and William Moseley described the field of political ecology as a way of considering the roles of political economy, power, and history in shaping human-environment interactions. So this is basically just a similar way of saying some of what I was saying earlier. Okay, so political ecologists use scale to consider how attempts to affect environmental change, such as deforestation, differ depending on what level of spatial detail we use to examine the issue. And when we talk about considering something, what we're really saying is how the issue changes if we look at it very narrowly versus very broadly and try to consider what's happened historically, what's going on in the world today, what are some of the conditions that maybe led to the choices that people are making. Okay. So one of the first things we want to talk about is population. And I know we talked a lot about population in the last unit. We've talked a little bit about it in this unit, but we haven't talked a lot about what population means for climate change. And, you know, the long and the short of it is really that when there's a lot of people on the earth, that means there's a much greater capacity for environmental change. And whether that's positive or negative just depends on your viewpoint. Okay, environmental change influences humans differently depending on who they are, where they live, what else is going on. And one of the ways to look at this is to look at, for instance, the idea of a natural disaster. Okay, natural disasters radically change environments within a relatively short period. So for instance, if we're looking at a wealthier area of the world, like say the United States, for instance, the hit is more likely to be financial. Okay, so people are going to lose homes, they're going to lose their stuff, there's going to be a lot of damage, it's going to be very costly. But in a poorer area of the world, the loss is not only going to be financial in terms of people are going to lose a large part of what they own, but also substantially more people are going to lose their lives. And part of that has to do with just some basic things such as housing construction and whether they're designed to withstand natural disasters, but it also has a lot to do with things like early warning systems and the ability to evacuate people, infrastructure issues, and things like that. So lots and lots of things to consider when we're talking about environmental change and how it can influence different groups of people differently. Okay, and just to kind of illustrate this, what we've got here are two world maps from our textbook, and the one on the left talks about mortality risks. Okay, so and looks at the top 3 deciles. Okay, and deciles are tenths. Okay, so when you're looking at what's the highest mortality risk in terms of natural disaster from drought, not surprisingly, we're looking at large parts of Africa, especially the Sahel right around kind of southern, or the Sahara Desert. Then we've got some geophysical issues, and now we're looking at kind of the Middle East, a little north of Saudi Arabia, right? Hydrology issues, and these are flooding and the like, drought and hydrology issues, so extreme flooding or extreme drought. And there's some areas in Africa. Geophysical issues and hydrological issues, some areas of northern India right along the China border, right? Drought, hydrological, and geophysical issues, and I'm totally not seeing where those are at, but I'm assuming they are Southeast Asia somewhere, quite possibly. Okay, and geophysical hazards are things like earthquakes and volcanoes, hydrological hazards, again, floods, cyclones, landslides, anything related to water. Then if we look, so that's mortality risks, right? You're most likely to die from one of these issues if you live in the areas indicated on the map. Now, if you've got, we're looking at for economic issues, it's in many ways a very different map to look at. Right, so for instance, high losses from hydrological issues, eastern half of the United States, really, right? That's a big area. Not surprisingly, parts of China, similarly with flooding and the like, where they're just not equipped to deal with it, right? Parts of India, China, Southeast Asia, both drought and hydrological hazards. And so you can see there's some overlap on these maps, right? But there's also a lot of areas where things are very, very different, or where you wouldn't expect to see as many problems. So another thing we want to look at when we're talking about environmental change is we need to look at patterns of consumption. And what we're really looking at there is who is using a lot of the resources, who's using very few of the resources, and what does that mean? And not just who's using the resources, but also what happens to things like the trash. Okay, so there's a lot of societies now that consume resources at a level and a rate that far exceed basic subsistence needs. We call those the rich world, by the way, our more developed countries. And increasingly are developing, and some of the higher end of our less developed countries. Okay, smaller numbers of people in parts of the world belonging to the economic core make far greater demands on the Earth's resources than do people in poorer countries. And by far greater, I mean things like people in the United States use something like 20% of energy resources. Okay, and just to hammer this home just a little bit, consumption, when we're talking about resource consumption, is directly tied in with technology and how much technology and things people use. That's just another way, incidentally, of measuring development. Okay, when we're talking about industrial technology, then we start looking at where are the resources coming from. So resource extraction practices like mining or logging provide the materials to produce the technologies that you and I know and love. They have historically and continue to today created severe environmental problems, and those environmental problems, we're still dealing with many of those problems here in the US, right? But they're increasingly becoming problems in the developing world because that's where we're going to get resources. Right, so technology has enabled humans to alter large parts of the planet in a very short period of time, and it allows us to alter our environment to make it livable. But with that alteration, there's always a cost, right? And so those costs include things like degrading the oceans. So that means that there's more trash in the oceans, that there's dead zones in the oceans, that the oceans are heating up, right? Land surfaces land surfaces would be things like desertification, for example, would be a great example. In the biosphere, now we're talking about global warming, and also, or the biosphere, I should say. I think I'm drawing a blank on what that one is. Anyways, but the atmosphere would be global warming, and the biosphere would be anything that affects those plants and animals that live above us. Interestingly, along with that development, it has been transportation issues, and each innovation in transportation requires an increase in resource use. So when we went from walking to horses, we had to feed the horses, right? So that required more resources. We went from horses to steam engines. That required still more resources, now in the form largely of coal or wood. And then when we went from steam engines to combustion engines for cars and the like, that now eats up a significant form of resources in the form of fossil fuels. And then we moved on and and develop trucks, which still eat way more fossil fuels than cars do, and also airplanes, which probably eat the most fossil fuels of all, I'd imagine. Okay, so these transportation innovations are incredibly useful. They allow us to access remote areas of the planet, areas that we would never have been able to get to, and we have altered and changed them. And they've also produced significant pollution, and that's a downside of industrialization, is these changes in transportation that increase pollution in the atmosphere. Okay, a lot of our energy for these transportation and for industrialization comes from non-renewable fossil fuels. These are things like coal, oil, and natural gas. Non-renewable, again, means once it's done, it's done. Okay, you can't make more, at least not in any short period of time. So as populations grow, so does the demand for energy, not surprisingly, because the standard of living goes up, right? We use a ton of oil, but it's a finite resource, and the effect of the shift away from that oil is certain to be felt to some degree in industrializing countries and in post-industrial countries. It'll be felt, I suspect, a little bit less in our less developed countries, just because they will have had less time to become reliant on it, and they'll be helping to develop and innovate a lot of those new technologies to deal with those that need to shift away from oil and gas. So when we talk about alternative forms of energy, even alternative forms of energy have environmental effects, right? At the core of, for instance, wind turbines that generate clean energy are what are called rare earth minerals, and the extraction and the processing of these have very negative consequences because, again, they're rare, they're hard to get to, right? They involve a lot of degradation and degrading the environment to get there. And these days, a lot of these rare earth minerals come out of Africa. Okay, rare earth elements are in demand not just because they get used in wind turbines, but also in alternative energy cars, computer screens, CFL light bulbs, cell phones, MRI machines, advanced weapon systems, you name it. If it's electronic, it requires rare earth elements, right? And these things are so rare that there's actually a whole industry built around recycling old computers and taking out the parts and the pieces and recovering those elements. Okay, the environmental consequences of mining these rare earth elements are so incredibly bad that we have actually moved from taking them as much as possible in the US to shifting them out and taking them from other areas because it's just so incredibly harmful and so bad for the environment. And because, again, the US is wealthy, we can afford to outsource that particular type of mining. So that's the end of our slideshow. Again, we talked a little bit about what are some of the ways in which humans alter their environment, what are some of those causes, and looked at everything from population issues to transportation issues, and talked about some of the alternatives to oil and what some of the impact of some of those are. If you have any questions, I'd be delighted to answer them. Please just feel free to bring them up when you come to class.